appears that the new maritime assets that the Chinese are deploying in Bajo de Masinloc and in other parts of Calayan Island Group are pretty much using the cover of marine scientific.
At first glance, the removal of a floating structure near Scarborough Shoal may seem like a minor maritime incident. No shots were fired, no ships were sunk, no territory visibly changed hands. Yet the event quickly drew attention across the region. Why? Because in the South China Sea, small actions often reveal much larger strategic realities. For more than a decade, China has expanded its presence across disputed waters through Coast Guard patrols, maritime militia operations, infrastructure construction, and persistent pressure on rival claimants. The Philippines has increasingly pushed back, relying not only on its own maritime forces, but also on growing support from the United States and other regional partners. Against that backdrop, reports that a Chinese-linked floating structure had been removed from the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal raised an important question. Did China back down? Or was Beijing simply adjusting its tactics while pursuing the same long-term objectives? The answer matters because Scarborough Shoal is about far more than reefs or fishing grounds. It is part of a broader contest over power, influence, and control in the South China Sea. And understanding that contest requires looking beyond the headlines to the strategic forces driving all sides of this dispute. The latest issue in the South China Sea started when Philippine authorities detected a floating structure near Scarborough Shoal, one of the region's most contested maritime features. According to Manila, the structure appeared within waters that the Philippines considers part of its exclusive economic zone. Its presence immediately raised concerns. The issue was not simply the structure itself, but what it might represent. Over the past decade, seemingly minor activities in the South China Sea have often evolved into more permanent forms of control. As a result, even temporary installations are viewed through a broader strategic lens. Philippine authorities protested and closely monitored the situation.
This is the photo of the movable floating platform that we are currently monitoring in Bajo de Masinloc. It has a deck area of approximately 30 square meters. Roughly, the dimensions are 5 meter to 6 to 7 meter in length.
While analysts debated whether the structure was a routine maritime activity, a political signal, or part of a broader effort to strengthen China's presence around Scarborough Shoal, the United States also paid close attention. Although Washington did not view the incident as a military crisis, it fit into a wider pattern of maritime tensions that have increasingly shaped U.S. policy in the region. Then came the unexpected development. The structure was removed. Its disappearance immediately sparked a new debate. Some observers saw it as evidence that diplomatic pressure from the Philippines, backed by U.S. support and international scrutiny, had produced results. Others argued that such conclusions were premature. China announced no change in policy, nor did it signal any reduction in its claims or activities in the area. The removal of the structure did not resolve the dispute. It merely shifted the debate from what China was doing to why it chose to stop doing it. And before answering that question, we first need to understand why Scarborough Shoal remains one of the most strategically important flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. To understand why the appearance and eventual removal of a floating structure generated so much attention, one must first understand Scarborough Shoal itself. At first glance, Scarborough appears insignificant. It has no cities, no population, and little obvious value on a map. Yet strategic competition is rarely determined by size. More often, it is determined by location. And Scarborough Shoal occupies one of the most important locations in the South China Sea. The shoal lies roughly 200 kilometers from the Philippine island of Luzon, placing it well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. At the same time, it sits near critical sea lanes linking Northeast Asia to the wider Indo-Pacific. For the Philippines, Scarborough supports fishing communities and forms part of the country's maritime frontier. For China, its significance is far greater. Beijing's interests in the South China Sea extend well beyond fisheries. The region is a vital strategic corridor through which a large share of global trade passes. Control over key maritime features enhances surveillance, extends operational reach, and strengthens a state's ability to shape activity across surrounding waters. This is why Scarborough cannot be viewed in isolation. For Chinese strategists, it is not simply a reef, but another position within a broader network of influence stretching across the South China Sea. For the Philippines, it is also a reminder of 2012, when China established effective control over the shoal without firing a single shot. That history explains why even a temporary structure can trigger alarm. To understand why the recent floating structure generated concern in Manila, we need to go back to 2012. That year, a confrontation erupted after Philippine authorities attempted to detain Chinese fishing vessels operating near Scarborough Shoal. At first, the incident appeared routine. Maritime disputes are common in the South China Sea, and similar confrontations had occurred before. China quickly dispatched maritime surveillance vessels, preventing Philippine authorities from carrying out their enforcement actions. What began as a dispute over fishing boats soon evolved into a prolonged standoff between two governments. Following diplomatic efforts involving the United States, reports emerged that both sides would withdraw and de-escalate the crisis. The Philippines withdrew. China did not. Chinese vessels remained and gradually established a continuous presence around the shoal. Over time, Filipino fishermen faced increasing restrictions in waters they had traditionally used for generations. What made the episode remarkable was not how much force China used, but how little. No missiles were launched, no naval battle occurred, no territory was formally annexed. Yet, the strategic reality changed. China achieved what military theorists call a fait accompli, a situation in which control is established incrementally until it becomes the new normal. The lesson extended far beyond Scarborough Shoal. For many observers across Southeast Asia, the episode demonstrated a broader Chinese approach to maritime disputes, using Coast Guard vessels, maritime patrols, administrative measures, and persistent presence to alter facts at sea. This is why every new activity around Scarborough attracts attention today. The concern is not necessarily the activity itself. It is whether it represents the first step in a process that has been seen before. Scarborough Shoal was not an isolated case. To understand why developments there generate such strong reactions, it is necessary to examine the broader pattern of Chinese behavior across the South China Sea over the past 2 decades. One of the defining features of China's strategy has been its gradual nature. Rather than relying on military conquest, Beijing has often pursued a slower approach designed to strengthen its position while avoiding a major regional confrontation. The pattern has appeared repeatedly. First comes presence: fishing vessels, maritime militia ships, Coast Guard patrols, or research activities around a disputed feature. Then comes persistence: a continuous presence that reinforces China's claims and complicates access for rival claimants. Over time comes administration, as Chinese authorities increasingly act as if they possess jurisdiction over the area. And in some cases comes consolidation. Mischief Reef offers one of the clearest examples. What was once a little-known feature eventually became a heavily developed artificial island with an airstrip, port facilities, radar systems, and military infrastructure. Similar developments occurred at Fiery Cross Reef and Subi Reef. From Beijing's perspective, these projects strengthen China's ability to protect vital maritime interests. For neighboring states, they represent a gradual shift in the regional balance of power. This is what makes Scarborough Shoal so sensitive. Many Filipino analysts do not see merely a disputed shoal. They see the possibility of another step in a familiar sequence. Whether that concern is justified remains open to debate. But the historical record explains why even minor developments attract close scrutiny. Because the most significant changes in the South China Sea have rarely occurred overnight. They have emerged through a series of incremental actions that gradually reshape the strategic landscape. And that brings us to the next question. How did Filipinos react when another potential chapter in this story appeared to be unfolding at Scarborough Shoal? The appearance of the floating structure near Scarborough Shoal immediately raised concerns across the Philippines. But the reaction was not driven by the structure alone. It was driven by memory. For many Filipinos, Scarborough Shoal is more than a disputed maritime feature. It is a symbol of what many view as one of the most significant strategic setbacks in modern Philippine history. The events of 2012 remain deeply embedded in the national consciousness. China established effective control over the shoal despite its proximity to the Philippine coast and its location within what Manila considers its exclusive economic zone. As a result, any new Chinese activity in the area is often viewed through the lens of that experience. Among fishing communities, the concerns were practical. Scarborough has long been an important fishing ground, and restrictions on access have affected livelihoods, incomes, and local economies. Within the Philippine security establishment, the focus was different. Military planners and maritime analysts viewed the structure not as an immediate threat, but as a possible indicator of future intentions. The concern was that it might represent the beginning of a process that had already unfolded elsewhere in the South China Sea. Public sentiment reflected these anxieties. Over the past decade, distrust of China has grown among many Filipinos, while support for closer security cooperation with the United States and other partners has generally increased. From the Philippine perspective, the lesson of Scarborough Shoal is clear. Strategic realities in the South China Sea can change gradually, and by the time those changes become obvious, they may already be difficult to reverse. From Washington's perspective, Scarborough Shoal has never been simply about a reef, or even the Philippines itself. It is part of a much larger question. Who will shape the balance of power in the Western Pacific? For decades after the Cold War, the United States enjoyed unrivaled naval dominance across Asia's maritime corridors. But China's rise has increasingly challenged that reality. As Beijing expanded its presence across the South China Sea, American policymakers became less concerned with individual incidents and more concerned with their cumulative effect.
Provide the following: name of vessel, intention, last and next port of call on Channel 16.
A Coast Guard patrol, a new structure, a maritime standoff, or an artificial island may appear insignificant on its own. Together, however, they can gradually reshape the strategic environment. This helps explain why the United States has deepened security cooperation with the Philippines in recent years. Joint military exercises have expanded, access to Philippine bases has increased, and Washington has repeatedly reaffirmed its alliance commitments to Manila. Against that backdrop, the floating structure attracted attention not because of what it was, but because of what it might signal. Would it become another step in China's effort to strengthen its position in the South China Sea? Or would resistance from the Philippines, backed by American support, impose meaningful limits on Beijing's actions? When the structure was eventually removed, some saw it as evidence that coordinated pressure had worked. But for Washington, the larger lesson was that competition in the South China Sea is increasingly becoming a test of endurance, credibility, and political will. As news of the floating structure spread, reactions extended far beyond China and the Philippines. What appeared to be a local maritime dispute was increasingly viewed through the broader lens of Indo-Pacific security. Across Southeast Asia, governments watched closely. Many ASEAN states have their own maritime disputes with China and saw the incident as part of a larger question. If China can steadily strengthen its position around one disputed feature, what might that mean for others in the future? Japan and Australia viewed the issue through a similar strategic lens. Both have become increasingly concerned about shifts in the regional balance of power and have strengthened security cooperation with the Philippines. For them, incidents such as Scarborough are not simply bilateral disputes, but tests of the rules and norms that underpin regional stability. Even Europe has become more attentive. As a significant share of global trade passes through Indo-Pacific sea lanes, instability in the South China Sea carries economic consequences far beyond Asia. The incident also revived attention on the 2016 arbitral ruling, which rejected many of China's expansive claims in the South China Sea. While Beijing continues to reject the ruling, much of the international community still regards it as an important legal reference point. Yet it would be a mistake to conclude that China was isolated. Many countries remain deeply tied to Beijing economically and prefer to avoid choosing sides. The more accurate assessment is that China faced growing scrutiny rather than overwhelming pressure. And that brings us to the central question of this story: did China remove the structure because of that pressure, or were other calculations at work? At first glance, the removal of the floating structure appeared to be a victory for the Philippines. The sequence seemed straightforward: the structure appeared, Manila protested, international attention followed, the United States voiced support, and then the structure disappeared. For many observers, the conclusion was obvious: China had backed down. But geopolitics is rarely that simple. Great powers do not usually abandon long-term strategic objectives because of a single diplomatic protest or a few weeks of negative headlines. They tend to think in terms of decades rather than days. The key question, therefore, is not whether pressure existed. Clearly, it did. The more important question is whether that pressure changed China's cost-benefit calculation. One possibility is that Beijing concluded the structure was generating more political attention than strategic value. Another is that it had already served its purpose, whether gathering information, testing reactions, or signaling Chinese presence. A third possibility is that China simply chose to avoid creating another flashpoint at a time of broader strategic challenges. None of these explanations require China to abandon its claims. And that is the critical point. The removal of the structure does not mean China has changed its position on Scarborough Shoal. Chinese vessels continue to operate in the area, and Beijing's broader objective of expanding its influence in the South China Sea remains unchanged. If anything, the episode suggests something more subtle. China may be willing to adjust tactics when costs rise, but not necessarily alter its long-term strategy. If the removal of the floating structure does not signal a Chinese retreat, what comes next? The most likely answer is neither war nor peace, but a prolonged period of strategic competition. The fundamental interests of both sides remain unchanged. China continues to view the South China Sea as vital to its security, maritime access, economic interests, and broader ambition to become the dominant power in East Asia. The Philippines, meanwhile, sees the same waters as essential to its sovereignty, economy, and national security. Because these interests are unlikely to disappear, future tensions will most likely emerge through what analysts call gray zone competition. Activities that fall below the threshold of war but still seek to alter the strategic environment. The Philippines should therefore expect continued Coast Guard encounters, maritime patrols, fishing disputes, and competing claims of jurisdiction. Information campaigns, legal disputes, and diplomatic pressure are also likely to intensify, while China's growing maritime capabilities will give Beijing more tools to sustain its presence across contested waters. For Manila, the challenge is not responding to a single incident. It is managing a long-term competition that could last for decades. The most important lesson from Scarborough Shoal is that strategic contests are rarely decided by dramatic events. More often, they are shaped by persistence, by who remains present, maintains alliances, and sustains political will over time. The South China Sea is unlikely to witness a decisive victory for either side in the near future. Instead, it will remain a steady contest over influence, access, and control. And that raises the final question: what is the most sustainable path forward for the Philippines? The central challenge facing the Philippines is not simply how to respond to China, it is how to protect its interests while living beside a much larger and more powerful neighbor. History shows that small and middle powers rarely succeed by matching great powers ship for ship or dollar for dollar. Instead, they succeed through resilience, diplomacy, partnerships, and strategic patience. For Manila, the first priority is strengthening maritime awareness. A country cannot defend what it cannot see. Investments in surveillance systems, Coast Guard capabilities, maritime patrol aircraft, drones, and intelligence sharing networks are likely to prove more valuable than dramatic displays of force. The second priority is maintaining strong partnerships. The Philippines does not need to contain China, but it must avoid isolation. Closer cooperation with the United States, Japan, Australia, and other partners helps raise the costs of coercion and strengthens deterrence. At the same time, realism requires acknowledging a basic fact: China is not going anywhere. It will remain a major economic partner, a powerful neighbor, and a central actor in regional affairs for decades to come. That means diplomacy cannot be abandoned. Communication channels must remain open, even during periods of tension. The objective should be neither confrontation nor accommodation, but stability. Most importantly, Manila must recognize that the South China Sea dispute is a long-term strategic competition. Success will depend less on dramatic victories and more on national capacity, economic strength, political unity, and consistent policy. In the end, the lesson of Scarborough Shoal is simple. The future of the South China Sea will be shaped by persistence rather than headlines. For the Philippines, the most sustainable path forward lies between resistance and realism.